Thrive Nation, on today's edition of the Thrive Time Show, we are interviewing the business consultant by the name of Jonathan Goldhill. And on today's show, Jonathan Goldhill teaches you how to grow your business from a family business, from a technician-driven business to a business that can scale. He's going to help you to grow your business from a job to an actual systemized company, one that has the capacity to grow beyond your personal efforts. If you want time freedom and financial freedom, today's edition of the Thrive Time Show is the show for you.
Some shows don't need a celebrity narrator to introduce the show, but this show does. 2 men, 8 kids, co-created by 2 different women. 13 multi-million-dollar businesses. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Thrive Time Show.
3, 2, 1, here we go!
Started from the bottom, now we here. Started from the bottom, and we'll show you how to get here. Started from the bottom, now we here. We started from the bottom, now we here. Started from the bottom, now we here.
Yes, and yes! Thrive Nation, on today's show, we are interviewing an incredible guest and a man who wants to talk to you about a family business, about the importance of having a playbook to scale up. I mean, what if everything is in your mind? What if it's just tribal knowledge and you're the only one that knows how to do everything? Folks, imagine, think for a second. What if you grew your business to a large level and to a large scale, and you were the only person in the business who knew the answer to every question? You could create a personal hell for yourself, and today's guest does not want that to happen to you. And so now, without any further ado, Jonathan Goldhill, welcome onto the Thrive Time Show. How are you, sir?
Yeah, Jonathan Goldhill here. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thanks for the intro, too. So a playbook is so important if you're going to scale up a business because, like you said, you can't have it in your head, and you've got to replicate yourself so you can get out of doing the technical work and have other people do it for you.
Now, Jonathan, for anybody who's wanting to look you up and kind of follow along, you know, a lot of our listeners, I know with Wolfgang Puck and John Maxwell, and a lot of the listeners, they end up visiting the website and purchasing a book or two. What's the best website for people to go to if they want to learn more about you as they're listening to today's show?
Sure. So the place for the book is disruptivesuccessor.com. And I also have a podcast called Disruptive Successor Show. And I have a website called thegoldhillgroup.com. And that's my coaching website. But the book, a free chapter of the book, as well as some tools, can be downloaded for free at disruptivesuccessor.com.
Disruptivesuccessor.com. When did you first have the idea to write this book and to launch this website?
So I started this a couple of years ago when I was working with my coach and looking at my ideal client profile and the ones that I had had the greatest success with. And I realized it was a pattern of next generation leaders of family businesses. These were mostly G2 leaders as opposed to G3 and G4. And these were guys who really needed a playbook and they needed a roadmap to scaling up. I have been very focused on scaling up entrepreneurial companies using methodologies like Gazelles and scaling up and the entrepreneurial operating system. And I thought, it's time for family businesses to have a playbook. And so that's when I came up with it. Yeah.
How often do you run into people that have a business? I mean, how common is it? Is this a common thing for people for the second generation to have a different vision for their business than maybe the founders?
Yeah, because, a lot of founders of the smaller businesses, and I'm talking like 20 to 200, maybe even fewer employees, the founder's vision was probably just to put food on the table and take care of the family, maybe get a second home if they were really successful. But the next gen leader is oftentimes stepping into the role where the father or mother founder was more of what I'd call a technician entrepreneur. And they were really skilled at the technical aspect, but they were not skilled at the leadership, at the management, at the culture, at the vision building. And, so they were, the first gen is oftentimes a great salesperson and a great producer. But the next gen really comes up with much bigger vision sometimes as wanting to take the company to a much bigger level. And then, of course, there's a whole other group of next gens that just sort of feel entitled or maybe feel like, wow, my father works so hard, I don't want to be, work like a dog like that. I'm not going into that business. So, but yeah, disruptors who realize that they've got to improve the processes. They may have to improve the product or service or upgrade it if it's going to stay relevant, because every so many years businesses go out of business because they're irrelevant. And, the business model oftentimes can be changed altogether too. Some companies that maybe were completely analog and now are completely online and digital. So.
Now, how long have you been doing this, and when did you? I mean, what motivated you to get into this business consulting?
Good question. So I started business consulting when I came out of business school in 1989 with an MBA in entrepreneurship and consulting. And what interested me about family businesses was that without realizing it, I mean, I knew my family had a very large clothing business. It was a multi-generational business. It didn't make it into my generation, but the affinity for trying to understand why didn't it make it into that next generation, what stopped us or the family, or why did they exit? I mean, and really the answer was really there was no one in the business who had an interest in taking it to a new level, and so they all went and did other things. And so I started working when I got out of college and out of business school with small businesses, mom and pops, helping them to grow their businesses. And I realized that, like, if you could just help a lot of small businesses, you would make really amazing changes in people's lives. And so it was sort of a desire to give back initially that got me into it, and then just the fascination with family business and consulting and scaling up. So it's been a long career.
Tell me about the business that your family started.
Yeah, so in the early 1900s, my grandfather and his two brothers joined their father and formed something called the Joseph H. Cohen and Sons, and they sold men's suits, overcoats, suits, slacks. They were a private label manufacturer. But in the early days, my grandfather and his brothers were ages 9, 11, and 13, and peddling men's suits on the streets of Manhattan to discount stores. And then they eventually got into the manufacturing, and by the 40s and 1940s, 1950s, they were making overcoats and pants and jackets for the Army. And then in the 60s, they were just phenomenally successful. They private label manufactured for many brands privately, the different big department stores they would sell to. And at one point, they had 1 million square feet of factory floor space in this country.
What?
So it was a large, successful business.
You said 1 million square feet?
Yes. Can you believe it?
Wow.
Yeah.
And so
that's a big business back then.
That's a massive business.
Today too, right?
So tell me about this. When you grew up watching this all around you, was it impressive to you?
I was really in awe because when I would visit my grandfather in New York City, he worked out of executive offices, and it was because they had built the business to the point where he could just be in a showroom where they would have suits outside, but he was largely involved with philanthropic endeavors. And when I went to visit him, it was always like put on your suit and tie, even as a little kid, and you'd go out to some fancy lunch place in New York City. And, back in the days when they didn't have cell phones, when he got a call, the restaurant owner would bring the telephone to his table and plug it in to his booth. So I was always pretty impressed by him. He used to take me to the New York Mets games, and we sat 6 seats behind the Mets dugout. And I remember he was friends with the owner and got autographed baseballs for me from the chauffeur who went on the field. I mean, so I was pretty in awe of this man. And what I saw of him was that he was a prolific painter. And so this is a guy who got up every single morning at 4 o'clock and started and painted for a few hours before he went into the New York City and into the offices and did his work. And the business was so successful that they sold it many years before they stopped operating it, and they continued to run it with lifetime employment contracts as the chief executive officer and chief operating officer, and so that's unheard of today, to be able to sell a company and maintain lifetime employment contracts.
That is wild. Now, other things I want to ask you about here is a lot of our listeners out there are running a family business, and perhaps, there's hundreds of things you coach people down the path to do. But are there 2 or 3 common dysfunctions that you see in family-run businesses that maybe you could, just very practical, you could say, hey, if you'll stop doing this, this will help you dramatically. Or if you start doing this, this will help you a lot. Are there a few super moves you could recommend for all the family-owned business owners out there?
Well, the first super move, I think, and this is true for any business, Clay, which is that people should recognize what are their zones of genius and get into those zones of genius and start to delegate away everything else that is not genius. And by delegate, I mean either outsource or redesign how you do it, or destroy it, or delegate it, somehow get it off your plate and empower other people. And this becomes a problem in family businesses because typically, in traditional businesses, you'll have a CEO, a CFO, a COO, or you'll have, real clear kind of job descriptions. But in a family business, you'll be like, okay, this brother is the inside guy and that brother's the outside guy. And I mean, it's kind of similar, right? So one person's in charge of maybe production, manufacturing, the other person's in charge of sales, and maybe finance falls to one or the other, but it's not as clear. And so the process or practice of delegating and elevating yourself, of finding your zone of genius, is the same practice of looking at one guy being an outside person, one guy being an inside person, and saying, let's kind of put some parameters around this and figure out how would we hire our replacement? What kind of a person would we look for that can, do those skills? And so that's one thing I think is super important and would be really valuable. The other thing, and again, I think some of this pertains to a regular business, but I specifically talk to disruptive successors about redefining what is the purpose for your business, because oftentimes they'll find in a smaller business, the mom or dad's purpose was just to provide for the family, and literally to pay for the house, the second home, put food on the table, and if they were large enough, maybe provide jobs for other families. But if you're going to scale up, you have to have a purpose that's really compelling, a purpose that is beyond just making a profit or making the product or service that you're delivering. It's got to be something that touches the hearts and the minds of the people that work for you, of the people that you sell your wares to. It's got to connect to them. And so I think having an elevated purpose and looking at your company as either just a place or a training ground to deliver and have that purpose be fulfilled. It doesn't matter what business you're in, whether it's plumbing, or some other form of construction, or making men's suits. The purpose may be just making people happy, making people have better environments, making whatever that purpose is. So I think those are a couple that are super important. And finally, in a family business, more so than any other business, you have to deal with whatever dysfunctions might be occurring within the business. So you've got to recognize that there's a room where you need to have the family conversations, and these are not the same rooms where you're having management or leadership conversations, and they're not the same room where you're having ownership conversations. In family businesses, that gets kind of convoluted, and oftentimes family members might fight or argue in front of other employees, and that's no way to run a business. You've got to take those conversations and put them in the appropriate place and have them at the appropriate time, and also have some kind of conflict resolution or protocols for how to deal with these types of conversations. So that's one of the things that makes family businesses really different.
What do you think about this idea of having those systems in place? And I have one of my good friends here is on today's show with me, James DiCristofaro. James is an attorney. James, you represent. You've worked with a lot of small businesses.
I have, yeah.
And I'm sure you've seen some businesses that are small in size, where there is not a system for anything. Like literally everything is in the head of the owner.
Oh, sure.
You've seen, because you know this because you're asking them for a basic legal document and no one can find it.
Exactly. Even the biggest businesses have problems with that as well.
So what practical advice would you have for somebody listening right now who has everything currently in their head?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
I
what
would say
advice?
that you need to start. So you need to document, obviously, and document. And look, this is not what I would consider to be the fun part of the business, but this is what makes for a valuable business. And so you have to think first in terms of, like, if your business were a book, what would the title of the book be? What would the chapter outlines be? And what should be in the chapters? And so in a typical book of this kind, where you're talking about standard operating procedures, you're covering human resources, you're covering marketing, you're covering sales, financial record keeping, accounting, operations, manufacturing. All of these things should be documented. So, for instance, in the HR chapter of the book, you're talking about how to recruit, how to hire, how to interview, how to do a background check, how to onboard, how to do a performance review. So you need to make it simple. You start with a high level, like think in terms of if this is a book, you're writing out what's the table of contents, what goes into each chapter, what are the questions that need to be answered within each chapter. And so that's the mindset that you have to have when building sort of the owner's manual or business manual for running your business. And then, things are constantly changing and updating. So we're using software more and more to run our businesses. So you have to keep updating the SOPs in this operating book.
And
it's not easy, but it's got to be done.
When you say SOP, I want to assume we're not going to lose anybody.
Yes.
I don't want to lose anybody today due to an abbreviation that maybe somebody doesn't know. So I don't want to assume anybody knows it. What does SOP stand for?
I use it to mean standard operating procedures. But look, in a small business, nothing is standard. So maybe it could be, sample operating practices or whatever you want to call it. But for most people, they understand it as like this is the operating manual, standard operating procedures or plans.
I think what you're talking about is powerful. It's the brass tacks, practical stuff that people need to talk about that no one wants to talk about. It's how to work with the family. It's how to document systems. It's how to document procedures. It's how to move from being a technician to being an actual entrepreneur. There's so much there. If people want to pick up a copy of your new book, where can they do that? And where can they download maybe a free chapter if they might have missed that earlier part of today's program?
Yep. So if they go to disruptivesuccessor.com, they can find my book, which is called Disruptive Successor, A Guide for Driving Growth in Your Family Business. It's also available on Amazon. You can find it under my name, Jonathan Goldhill. But go to the website, grab a free chapter, download some of the free tools, start putting it into implementation in your business. And look, my book is like being a virtual coach. If you run into problems, pick up the phone or schedule an appointment with me and I'll help you.
Brother, I appreciate you for joining us on today's show. And if people do want to get in touch with you, what's the preferred way to get in touch with you?
Well, you can find me and get in touch with me on LinkedIn at Jonathan Goldhill. I think it's a unique enough name. Or you could email me, jon@thegoldhillgroup.com.
Jonathan Goldhill, thank you so much for joining us on today's edition of the Thrive Time Show. And I greatly do appreciate your time and your knowledge bombs that you've dropped with our listeners. We have about 1 million folks that listen to the show each and every week, and I know that so many of them just filled out their notepads with stuff they need to do immediately. So again, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it, Clay.
And now, without any further ado, 3, 2, 1, boom! Andrew, I want to ask you a question real quick here because a lot of our listeners are discovering that we have the Thrive Time Show that's available on iTunes, obviously, iHeartRadio, Podbean, the different players. But then there's the Thrive Time Show that's available on Rumble.
That's true.
Now, on Rumble.com, that's where the Thrive Time Show is unleashed.
That's right.
So if you're listening right now and you're going, man, I want the unleashed version of the Thrive Time Show, check us out tonight on Rumble.com. Go to Rumble.com. Subscribe there, and I think that you, my friends, will have a blasty blast.